they think the future of consciousness studies, at least as far as biology or perhaps empirical sciences are going to take us, and then we'll open up for discussion. I would like to make a request to the audience that we restrict questions which are not particularly focused on any aspect of the details of the talks that were presented today, but more general ideas that perhaps more speakers can reflect upon or can be of a more general nature. Thank you very much for being here, and I know it's been a long and tiring day, but I hope we'll be able to end up with some perhaps slightly more understanding of the issues. Okay, so as a biologist, and again I'm heavily biased here, let me just put out some of the important issues that I found came up today. First is, of course, at this point I brought up in the morning itself, is that if you're going to understand consciousness further, how important are definitions, measurements, qualitative and quantitative assays, how important are taking such an approach be in our further understanding, or does it constrain our certain development of certain concepts because they are not empirically yet approachable. The second point I think that many of the speakers brought up was that of a continuum of processes across species, across different life forms, and so including consciousness, which I think is an important process that we wanted to understand. And are these comparative studies that we've been talking about justified? Are we talking about differences of degree, or are they truly differences in kind, which will be obscured if we force a comparative understanding of these processes? Related to this, of course, is that our understanding of the biology of perception and cognition, how do they inform our understanding and design of intelligent machines? Will machines ever replicate human intelligence? The next point I thought, which was interesting, is very few speakers today actually used the word consciousness. And again, so as biologists studying animals, perhaps humans in a continuum, have we outlived the importance of the concept of consciousness? Should we focus really on the processes that comprise consciousness, which include processes of cognition, perception, volition, etc., as was pointed out? The philosophical basis of cognitive studies in animals and humans, what is more parsimonious? Do we assume animals have a mind, or don't they have a mind? How do we take it forward? Because I think this is something that most of us practicing empiricists, especially those working in animal cognition, have always faced this problem of whether we assume to start off with whether the animal has a mind or not. And this is an important issue, especially as the world is opening up to different forms of thought, bodies of knowledge. Perhaps we need to address these issues. The last point I want to bring up is the importance of empiricism. Again, and I mentioned this earlier, how important is empirical work? And this was brought through by two speakers. Dr. Kapoor brought up her description of the Kashyapa Samhita and mentioned this point that these are interesting ideas, but we have no idea whether to accept them or not, and perhaps we need empirical work into them. And of course, the last talk by Rajesh, who threw up a whole range of issues of how different philosophical and conceptual positions of consciousness, mind, and self may or may not be shaped by empirical work. Do we at all need empirical work, or are we fine going along the lines that we have been? And so here I will pass on the mic to the different speakers if they can quickly summarize their positions on any of these issues, some of these issues, what they think are burning issues, and then we can open it.
I would like to highlight a statement made by Karl Jaspers a long time back. He said psyche is like an ocean. So consciousness is like an ocean. Psyche is like an ocean. So the ocean can be studied by different people in different manner. It could be depth, it could be salinity, it could be the beach, it could be the waves, it could be the typhoon. So I find people are talking about the psyche or the consciousness as they see it. Unless we have a dialogue, we cannot understand the ocean. So there is a need to pull in our ideas and actually try to understand consciousness out of that, churning of minds. So we cannot say this is not acceptable. I think we should not go for not accepting somebody's position or perspective, but we need to pull in our whatever we know, because we are really studying the ocean.
I just want to flag that last thing that you said about empiricism, because I think we have to be somewhat empirical about our approach to empiricism. What I mean is there's a very narrow kind of empiricism, especially when it comes to consciousness, sentience, selfhood, and other species, where the default hypothesis is a kind of mechanistic behaviorism, right? And I think that if that is what we mean by empiricism, where you start from that as the default and then tilt your your sword against those windmills, it's not a good place to start. You're better off with a more expansive empiricism where maybe we at least open to the possibility that and which to me seems obvious, that cephalopods and other species are as likely to be sentient and conscious. And rather than saying are they conscious or not, a much better question might be what kinds of consciousness do they have, rather than.
Yeah, I agree with that approach. I mean, two things that you said. One thing being I think these big concepts, so consciousness, theory of mind, language, I mean, they are too big to tackle as a unity. I think what needs to be done is to split them into their components. And there is, I think, where we can do the work. In the end, whether, an animal has language like we do, consciousness like we do, it's a question that is very easy to answer. The answer is no. And then what we have to determine, in my opinion, is what are the things that are similar, what are the things that are not. And there, I think, is where most of the empirical work can help us.
I think I'll say two things. One, that for me it's very hard to think about how to study consciousness, because given sort of conscious awareness usually contains either a sensory percept or a memory or some other emotion or something, which are all attributable to certain specific brain areas. So how to remove the is not at all clear to me. The second thing I'll say is that at least as an experimentalist, when we work with monkeys as well, and so do these guys, we often find that attributing states of mind or intentions and beliefs to animals is actually a good way to train them. So, but of course, to prove that they have those beliefs or states of mind is much more difficult. And I think the work of Robert and also Joseph here is some of the more outstanding examples of how you can show certain beliefs and states of mind. Thanks.
Very briefly reiterate what Joseph said already, that I'm reluctant to use the word consciousness very much because I think it's just such a broad concept, and that I'm never sure what other people are thinking when I say that word. I think this is my personal comfort zone, is I would rather make a much narrower statement and operationalize it, and that's what I hope came across in my talk, for instance, that I want to say this is what it does. I'm proposing, and I'm going to look for something that an animal does and ask whether that's consistent with that hypothesis or not. And that's about the only way I see that we can approach that. And it's a much more elemental approach, and in some ways maybe tedious.
A number of different things were said today, but I feel that equally large number of things were not said. And of course, I can't say them right now, but I will just mention a few areas where we need much thinking, and maybe a day is not enough to talk about all this. One important area which I thought was not sufficiently covered, barring maybe some passing mention, is evolution. Okay. So if consciousness is a property, whether it is fundamental or whether it is emerging property, how would natural selection act on it? Does it give any fitness advantage, or is it selectively neutral? If it is selectively neutral, then why and how it came in evolution? If it gives an advantage, what is the advantage? Okay. and so on. So that is a large area which we did not touch. The relationship between consciousness and language is another area which we did not sufficiently cover today. So there are a large number of aspects that are still remaining, and I think this is something that we need to continue with.
Okay, I think I'm pretty much same page with Joseph and Rob. And for the consciousness of the language, those things really vague and huge concept, and which is really tough to prove without kind of subject report, for example. But if we divide it into the subcomponents, which can be empirically studied, to see like which subcomponent can be shared with other animals, to what extent those animals shared with humans and so on. By doing that, we can actually roughly depict the pictures of how much we kind of contain from the non-human animals and how we much get those ability from those ancestors and so on. So I think it's very important to divide into the more subcomponent and then do some empirical research onto it to see the more broader picture, like how we can actually get those bigger ability as well.
So I think if you're going to study consciousness, you have to bite the bullet and use the word. And I don't think there's a particular problem here, because I think the concept, it can be very vague, but it can also be made quite precise. And I think there are ways of describing conscious experience that make it precise in different senses, whether it's phenomenal, access, primary, higher order, and so on and so forth. And where I agree with the Rob and Giuseppe and you is that we do need to separate it out. So there are different aspects to conscious experience, self-consciousness, and they may be shared to different extents by different species, by different individuals, perhaps even by different cultures. And I think we would move towards an understanding of the approach to the science of consciousness a little bit like the history of the study of life, where life turned out to be not a single thing either, but a property of a number of different processes like metabolism, reproduction, and so on and so on. And once we understood life as this constellation concept, then that dissolved the sort of need that people had to propose an essence vitale or something really mysterious. And in the same way that I think we can come up with mechanistic accounts of the different sorts of phenomenal properties that we need to use the word consciousness to describe and not brush it under the carpet, we may find not a solution to the hard problem, but a cure to it.
I mean, when I understand and I sympathize with what you said. I mean, but when we study nonverbal animals, we face a huge problem when comparing to the kinds of things that you can do with humans. And for instance, some definitions of, say, episodic memory, there is a very important subjective component, and we can get to it because we can ask the subjects. We cannot. We don't have the tools to ask those questions that you can ask with humans. And therefore, I think we have to be cautious. I want to think humble and say where our limitations are. And you guys can talk about consciousness because you have much more information. You have more tools to probe these questions than we do. And therefore, I don't think we have to be humble and we have to say where our limitations are. That's all.
And what you said is obviously right, that the great advantage of working with humans is you ask them what they experience, even if you can't always trust what they say. So it's not quite that simple. But on the other hand, I think, as you know, and there are beautiful paradigms that you've probably developed, such as metacognitive commentaries and things like that. Some lovely work by Petra Störig and Alan Cowie a long time ago, now looking at analogues of blind sight in monkeys, where they can make comments on first-order perceptual discriminations. Now, you don't know just from that behavior that by itself is not sufficient to say that they had or had not a conscious experience. However, the circumstantial evidence provided by the shared anatomy and dynamics and so on, I think, leads you to that's the most sensible interpretation. So yes, of course, the methodological problems are there, but they're methodological problems. They can be perhaps addressed.
I get the impression that everyone is opting for scientific parsimony. Do you think scientific parsimony will answer the questions what we are looking at, consciousness?
Yes.
Would any of you want to respond?
No, can get answers, but science won't give them. It falls outside of the realm of science. I mean, humans have other ways of knowing besides science. Now, if we are playing the science game, yes, that's what it's needed. I know that some people look for answers outside of science, and I think that's wonderful. They would not be the answers that would satisfy me. But I think, yes, sometimes that is better than nothing.
I actually want to add something to that. There's a long history in the humanities of techniques which are non-scientific but not disrespectable, right? Philosophy, literature, these are all things that we have used to explain primarily actually human experience. I see no reason why it can't go the other way, that we extend the humanities into biology rather than bring science into the humanities. Why not?
Could I invite the audience? Of course, absolutely. It's supposed to be. There's a mic there as well.
Yeah. I don't want to be a party pooper, but I was listening to one of the learned speakers who asked this question whether consciousness, what evolutionary advantage could be had, which is having consciousness. Does it occur to any one of you that consciousness may have been needed so species could enjoy their existence in life? It's part of having fun in life, part of enjoying the life's élan vital, and it has really not a very serious thing in itself, but it's really that thing which makes us less serious and allows us to take us less seriously. And if we do not understand it, I don't think we shall ever understand consciousness. Consciousness is not given to us to fall unconscious. In any process, meditation or otherwise, which makes you less conscious is not really interesting to human beings.
Does anybody want to respond to that?
Well, I did mention being selectively neutral. Okay. And there are a number of things which have evolved in spite of being selectively neutral. Okay, so that is there. So that thinking is there. Everything doesn't have to be adaptive. Okay, there are a number of characters which are selectively neutral. They can still be there.
Before you start, can I just make an appeal to the students behind who seem to be very quiet? I'm sure many of you have questions. Please do come up. Sure. Please do come up and ask questions if you have any. Yes, please. Go ahead.
When there were reports in Africa of snow on the equator, the reports were regarded as unscientific when brought to the National Geographic Society or whichever it was in London, because it was known that you couldn't have snow on the equator. Scientists, and I talk as a scientist too, trained in MIT and Cambridge, that it's impossible to have things which exist outside the defined domain of science. And it's very easy for us to do this. Here, we are in India, which is known as the land of the Veda. That is to say, the land of pure knowledge, Shuddha Vidya. When you go to Eskimo land, there are 100 words for snow. Living on the equator, you might doubt the existence of snow, and all your scientists would tell you very good reasons why water could never become solid. When you come to India, I like to point out that they're not just 5 or 10 names for God. There's 1,000 names for Vishnu. There's 1,000 names for Mother Divine. There is 100 names for Shiva, and some people will put 1,000s on them. India has a deeper knowledge of certain subjects than anyone else, as shown by the language diversity. They've thought about it, they've reasoned about it, they've brought it out to the nth degree. One of the subjects is Sankhya, and Sankhya is superseded, in my opinion, slightly by the way Kashmiri Shaivism develops the tattvas of Sankhya and develops them from whatever it is, 16 to 26 or something like that. I get the numbers, can't remember the numbers. Now there are 5 Shuddha Tattvas in Sankhya. Shiva Tattva, Prakriti, Shakti Tattva, Icha Tattva, Ishvara Tattva, and Shuddha Vidya Tattva. These are all aspects of pure consciousness. They were translated by Maharishi Mahesh Yogi into a language which became familiar to all his students. Pure existence, pure awareness, pure intelligence, pure creative intelligence, pure consciousness, and so on. They are a language which deals specifically with the state that we will talk about tomorrow. You can't know consciousness fully unless you've experienced pure consciousness. I can say that from not phenomenal experience, but from another kind of experience. Now, I put it to you in all humility, as one scientist to another, that we must allow other cultures to have their languages and to admit that if Eskimos have lived all their lives in snow, they have a right to 100 words about snow. The yogis, the Kashmiri yogis, have the right to discuss pure consciousness. I find it grossly offensive that my colleagues at Oxford have defined the term self out of the dictionary because they can't define self. So that consciousness is now not that which has self-knowledge, but it's merely awareness. So that is my perspective, and I put it to you that maybe it's a perspective we can also live with. Thank you.
Well, if I can just say something briefly, I mean, in terms of self, and well, Oxford University Press just published a wonderful handbook of the self, hardly defining it away. They make many useful contributions to how one might ramify the concept, taking into account lots of cultural different perspectives. Of course we should do that. I don't think anybody here would say otherwise, and I don't think I've heard anybody say otherwise on the philosophical or the religious or the scientific side. Nobody has ever said that at all. So I'm not quite sure what you're on about, frankly, with respect to that comment.
I'm on about attending a conference on embodiment at this very institution 4 years ago, of which consciousness was a disallowed term, almost.
Well, consciousness obviously not a disallowed term at this conference. It seems to be, well, I don't think I would have been invited if it had been. And so that, yes, of course, that there should be an acceptance. In fact, but the constructive interpretation of your question for me is one of the things I've struggled with, one of the things I wanted to learn and hope to learn from this, is there is obviously this extremely rich tradition within Indian philosophy and thinking about specifically phenomenology. There are also stories of origin and stories of mechanism and so on, but it's really the idea of the kinds of experiences that people can have that I think across cultural perspectives is particularly valuable for. So what I would like to hear a bit more about is how this interaction should progress. I was lucky enough to, in Washington a few years ago, at a neuroscience meeting, there was a Dalai Lama gave a plenary address, and it was wonderful. Somebody asked the question, it was a little bit like the question I asked you earlier. So would you be willing to overturn beliefs from the Buddhist text if science demonstrated? And he was very clear, yes, of course. And so what I want to know is what the most productive dialogue should be between the vast repository of especially phenomenological knowledge in Hindu thought and the I think, very successful Western scientific approach that doesn't need to extend to strange new physics or all this stuff. Just with what we've got, we can already do a lot.
I'm Prem Sevak Sudhish, Center for Consciousness Studies, the Albach Educational Institute. Most of you here have something to do with biology, and especially, there have been talks of empirical modeling. As a computer scientist, I am especially interested in following the ultimate artificial intelligence dream of creating a machine that acts like a human. So as a biologist, as to all of you as biologists, my question would be that what place do you ascribe to the concept of intuition in consciousness? And whether it would be able to, whether computer science would ever be able to get to create a machine that is human-like. To refer to an example, I would refer back to Arun's talk, where he showed a slide where we saw that the brain actually blurs an image, and then that's how we actually see it. My take on that is that it blurs it to the right degree, and not all images are blurred the same way. And so what is it that guides the brain into blurring it to the right degree? So for example, in pattern recognition and computer science, we go to very fine details, and as humans, we know that a mother can easily distinguish between her two very young identical twins. So if we were to just blur it and see the two blurred images of those twins, they would probably look identical, and then a machine would not be able to distinguish between them.
Well, so I believe that at least regarding the amount of blurring question, which is I think depending upon the needs of a particular task, you may be able to selectively attend to the course structure necessary for the task at hand. One of the reasons why course structure is nice is because different images of the same object might look the same at the level of course structure. But if you look at the finer details of the object of these images, you'll find that they differ quite a bit. You imagine the different views of my hand. You might find that all the different views have a lot of differences in finer details, but maybe not so much in the course structure. That's one of the reasons why we think course structure is a nice representation. But that's of course not to say that you don't see blurry images. What you're actually what I think is fair to say is that you base your responses on certain aspects of image content, but not on other aspects. But of course, you have the ability to focus on whichever aspects are necessary for the task at hand.
Right, yeah, so to fine-tune my question.
Could we just give the others a chance? Maybe you can take up this discussion later. Jonathan? I'm sorry.
Yeah,
could we have Jonathan? He was here just before.
I'm sorry.
Sorry.
I just wanted to add one more perspective on the relation, say, of Vedic traditions and the other traditions, Indic and other Eastern traditions that have their own perspectives on self and non-self. I do want to add, actually, that the majority of Buddhists in the world actually believe in self. Those are the Far Eastern Buddhists, and the anatta, or doctrine they held to be Buddha's preliminary doctrine, and the Mahaparinirvana Sutra was supposedly is very explicit that once you've mastered the anatta doctrine experientially, then the all-self doctrine is there. And in India, this is not generally known. Many people do know it. And so it comes out ontologically, so far as I can gather, identical with Advaita. But that isn't what I stood up to say. It just came out. What I stood up to say was just to make one more comment on the way I like to approach, and this has been my lifelong work, the interface between these ancient traditions and modern science. My take on it, and I suspect many of you will be sympathetic with this, that what these traditions give us is an expanded experiential basis, an expanded phenomenological basis. I think it's unquestioned that they give us that. Then what I think is needed is to use the standard scientific intersubjective corroboration and falsification and methodologies to figure out what we think about it, because every one of us is outside of most of the traditions. So this is the lingua franca to separate out tradition and belief and wishful thinking as well as we can. So that would mean that every one of the methodological approaches and every one of the partial things that roughly speaking, that I've been hearing people say, seems to me to be an important part of the overall project, even if you're only interested in finding out the real significance of the Vedic traditions. and the other one like that, Taoism, the other great traditions. And I'm going to try to give one teeny taste tomorrow. I'm also very convinced that the phenomenology of the experiences they make possible, they will have some very useful things to say factually and in suggestion on our own thing. So that's the way I would want to make those links. And Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, he is, whom I studied with for years, absolutely behind that program. And he also held the thing, if something in the tradition, modern science shows it's false, well, we change that. So the really greats are very flexible like that.
Yes, I wonder whether the oppositional language that has begun to arise in the course of the discussion with the panel is where you actually want to leave the day. There's a clear sense of two different languages and a forced choice between them, but it was really Sunil's question that made me think maybe there's more of an opening. We know that the science has to be disciplined. We know what good empirical science is. We know what undercuts it or makes it impossible to do science. And no scientist is willing to give that up. The voice that hasn't been heard as much, and maybe that's the topic of tomorrow, is there a kind of disciplined reflection that we can call phenomenological? Is there a kind of practice that people can engage in so that there can be some intersubjective agreement or measure across phenomenological reflectors or meditators or whatever you want to call them? Can the big questions be discussed in a rational, reasonable way, or is the introduction of big concepts immediately to fall into a sort of arbitrariness and irrationality? And if it's possible to engage in some sort of disciplined reflection, the Dalai Lama and his followers would say yes, then that might provide a baseline, actually an interesting one for correlational studies, right? Because if I could have a series of monks who could reliably place themselves in a particular state and then do correlational studies with neural firings, I might actually have interesting empirical data. However, in this case, the independent variable is the phenomenological state, and the dependent variable are the neurological state. That strikes me as at least potentially empirical form of research, not scientific in the traditional sense, nonetheless one that provides us with information about the self or consciousness.
So I think we have come to the end of a very long day. I just want to end with one comment, which is that the Indo-Tibetan traditions themselves had no shortage of rational deliberation on phenomenology, right? I mean, that is exactly what philosophy does. So, but to expand that to include philosophy and science from other traditions is a no-brainer, so to speak.
Thank you very much. Although Rajesh does say it's the end of a long day, it's still not the end of the long day, as Sangeeta would like you to believe. The poster session is on. There's tea and coffee. But I do hope that the discussion that came up, and we do end on that very positive note, and I'm sure this discussion will continue tomorrow, perhaps with a whole range of other people who will bring in to bear on these problems. Thank you very much again for a wonderful day.